Magic has existed long enough that we've seen all sorts of abilities get printed. There have been enough cards that each color and type has had general expectations as to what sorts of cards and abilities they'd get. Of course, for all these expectations and design rules, there are cards that serve as exceptions to them, whether it's an effect that doesn't fit a color or an effect that does something that no other card really does. Magic has produced several cards with weird abilities that don't fit in with the broad expectations of what a card should do. And starting us off at number 10, we have Endless Horizons. This enchantment costs 3 generic and 1 white mana, and when it enters the battlefield, you search your library for any number of plains cards, exile them, and then shuffle. At the beginning of your upkeep, you may put a card you own, exiled with Horizons, into your hand. White generally does not get many effects related to searching lands from the library, let alone a card able to grab so many. Nothing will prevent you from exiling every plains in your deck with Endless Horizons, since there is no upper limit on how many cards you can pick, as long as they're all plains. In theory, if your deck only runs plains for lands and you do this, you've just thinned your deck of all lands and will now only draw non-lands. If you already had enough lands, this card can be fairly useful. And even if you do still need more lands, Endless Horizons will give you one from exile on each of your upkeeps. Of course, if your opponent destroys Endless Horizons, or even just bounces it to hand, then all of your plains are now permanently exiled. This makes the card somewhat risky if you actually want the lands, since with no actual protection, it becomes a very easy way to cut you off of your lands. Of course, you could always just choose to leave some plains left in your deck, but if you do this, then you'll have a chance of drawing those plains that you were trying to avoid. Endless Horizons feels like a riff on Land Tax, a white card that searches lands from the deck that predates solidifying that green is the color of land searching. To this day, white occasionally gets cards that help play more lands, but Endless Horizons remains undoubtedly the most bizarre iteration of the effect. Deck thinning and land searching are two game concepts white tends to struggle with, and while Endless Horizons is far from a good card, it is at least somewhat unique and not a terrible card by any means in a format like Commander. But it is an obscure effect, one white is unlikely to see any further riffs on directly. And at number 9, we have Jester's Mask. This artifact costs 5 generic mana and enters the battlefield tapped. You can pay 1 generic mana, tap, and sacrifice Jester's Mask to make target opponent put all cards in their hand on top of their library. Then you search that opponent's library for that many cards. The opponent puts those cards into their hand, then shuffles. Even as early as the first set, there have been ways to remove the cards in your opponent's hand. However, unlike typical hand attack cards which force your opponent to discard and leave them with fewer cards overall, Jester's Mask instead replaces every card you get rid of. Even if your opponent had a full hand of 7 cards, it's likely you'll be able to find some selection of cards in the deck you'd rather give them instead. Since Jester's Mask lets you give your opponent any cards as long as it was in their deck, you can give them a hand of just all lands. But even then, this is far less helpful than just making your opponent discard their hand or just the most relevant cards. In competitive Magic, we have a card like Thoughtseize that allows you to both look at your opponent's hand and then pick the most relevant cards in it to get rid of. In comparison, Jester's Mask not only doesn't let you know what cards you're getting rid of, it makes you replace them all. The fact that it enters tap 2 means that your opponent usually has at least one turn to play the most important cards in hand before you get rid of them. While Jester's Mask is somewhat unique in that it does let you look at your opponent's whole deck, its other drawbacks make the information not all that worth it. After all, with Thoughtseize only costing 1 mana and this costing 5, beyond the novel nature of its weird effect, there's no reason to ever consider actually using Jester's Mask. By the time you can cast Jester's Mask and then wait to untap it, your opponent has likely already set up and maybe even developed one of their deck's primary threats. As a piece of hand attack that comes down often too late to stop anything and doesn't actually hurt your opponent's card advantage, Jester's Mask comes off as little more than a bad joke. And it's not even an entirely unique one, seeing as how the black card Head Games has a quite similar effect. However, Head Games is a black card, which is the color that's most commonly known for hand disruption in the first place. Jester's Mask came first, and it being a colorless card any deck could hypothetically run only serves to make it all the more weirder. And at number 8, we have Shared Fate. This enchantment costs 4 generic and 1 blue mana. If a player would draw a card, that player exiles the top card of your opponent's libraries face down instead. Each player may look at cards they exiled with Shared Fate, and they may play lands and cast spells from among those cards. This card essentially forces you to play with your opponent's deck instead of your own. Unlike many cards that allow you to play with your opponent's card, it doesn't let you use mana of any type or color to cast it. While you can play lands you draw, this means that unless you already play the same colors, you might be somewhat limited on what cards you draw that you can actually cast. Of course, you're still allowed to play cards that were already in your hand, but considering you can't actually draw more cards, your options on that front are fairly limited. In practice, Shared Fate mostly just slows the game down as players try to adjust to their new decks. A deck built around Shared Fates needs to both be playable enough to consistently cast the card, but not be so good that your opponent is better off playing your own deck. This really highlights what makes this card so weird. Shared Fate is a card that's at its strongest when you're playing an objectively worse deck than your opponent. And when your deck's strongest move is to switch decks, you are by default relegated to being a silly gimmick at best. In the years since its printing, there have been other cards that have experimented with similar design space. Share the Spoils also lets people play with cards from the top of your opponent's decks, but this is in addition to their draw as opposed to outright replacing it. Share the Spoils leans more into the chaotic energy of the effect, whereas Shared Fate's clunky nature makes it feel more like a prison tool deliberately used to slow the game down. The fact that its design space has seen some toying with in recent years does somewhat limit its weirdness, but the sheer restrictive nature of Shared Fate is enough for it to earn a spot on this list. However, further cards stand out a bit more in just how bizarre they are. And for that reason, Shared Fate only winds up here at number 8. And at number 7, we have Time Shifter. This is an artifact from Mirrodin that costs 5 generic mana. At the beginning of each upkeep, each player exiles the top card of the library. The player who exiled the card with the highest mana value takes an extra turn after this one. If 2 or more players are tied for the highest, the tied players repeat this process until the tie is broken. Time Shifter essentially makes it so that instead of following an actual turn order, the next turn is decided by who exiles the highest mana value card. In theory, with ways to manipulate the top card of your deck, you can chain together several turns back to back. In practice, however, especially in formats like Commander, Time Shifter leads to turns becoming extremely lopsided. In terms of consistently chaining together extra turns, cards like Nexus of Fate have made for plenty more consistent ways to do exactly that. Taking an extra turn is one of the most powerful things you can do, which means letting your opponent take an extra turn is one of the worst things you can do. It's not impossible that someone wins off the back of your own Time Shifter as you let them get ahead of you or win right there on the spot. But beyond any concerns of playability, what makes Time Shifter so strange is how much it muddles the flow of the game. The official rulings for Time Shifter caution players to remember which player would have taken the next turn if Time Shifter's ability hadn't triggered the first time. This is because whenever Time Shifter is eventually removed, the original turn order returns. This can be difficult to keep track of if Time Shifter sticks around for a long time, and gets even more confusing if there are 2 Time Shifters on the battlefield. With 2 Time Shifters on the battlefield, 2 extra turns are created for each turn played, meaning that you have to keep track of who has what turns and when they happen. Time Shifter is one of the Mirrodin block's failed experiments in pushing artifact design. The card is undeniably powerful on some level considering that it does offer repeatable infinite turns. But this power is doled out so haphazardly it's easy for it to turn against you. Symmetrical designs that benefit both players have always existed. But Time Shifter pushes things so far it actively derails the structure of the game as the flow of turns is reduced to random chance. And at number 6, we have Dreams of the Dead. This enchantment costs 3 generic and 1 blue mana and has an ability that can be activated for 1 generic and 1 blue mana. This ability returns target white or black creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield. That creature gains a cumulative upkeep of 2 generic mana, and if it would leave the battlefield, exile it instead of putting it anywhere else. Cumulative upkeep is an older mechanic where at the beginning of your upkeep you put an age counter on each permanent you control with the cumulative upkeep. Then pay as upkeep cost for each age counter on it or sacrifice the permanent. This means that the longer you try and keep a card with cumulative upkeep, the more you have to pay. While this card itself does not have an upkeep cost, it does mean that creatures you bring back won't be sticking around very long. This makes Dreams of the Dead seem rather lackluster when compared to more conventional options like Reanimate. What tips it over into being outright weird, however, is the fact that it's a blue card. Black historically has always been the color with the most ease at reanimating creatures. White has also gotten some pieces of reanimation over the years, and even green can bring back cards from the graveyard to the hand. However, blue generally does not interact with the graveyard, and especially does not reanimate creatures. The fact that Dreams of the Dead restricts you to white and black creatures almost feels like a nod to this, with this blue enchantment completely incapable of bringing back mono blue creatures. Usually when a card limits you to certain colors, they tend to at least share a color with that card. Dreams of the Dead requires you to be playing white or black to actually get any value out of it, and that value is easily outscaled by various other cards in both colors. Its flagrant breaking of the color pie does at least earn it a spot as a proper novelty. And at number 5, we have Serum Powder. This artifact costs 3 generic mana and can be tapped for 1 generic mana. This ability is nothing strange, and if you ignore the card's other ability, then Serum Powder is a simple mana rock. However, Serum Powder's second ability is the only ability on a playable card to reference mulligans. Anytime you could mulligan and Serum Powder is in your hand, you may exile all cards in your hand, then draw that many cards. You can do this in addition to your actual mulligans, meaning that essentially Serum Powder is an extra mulligan that you can use if you draw it after mulliganing. This is even stronger than a normal mulligan since it draws the same number of cards that you originally had, whereas a typical mulligan will give you 1 less card. This bonus mulligan is balanced in part by exiling the cards from your original hand instead of shuffling them back in the deck, meaning if an important card is in your hand, you may not want to use Serum Powder and exile it. However, some decks have actually been built to take advantage of this exile thanks to Eternal Scourge being castable from exile. Eldrazi aggro decks would use Serum Powder in an attempt to exile multiple copies of Eternal Scourge to then cast later on. While there may not be decks that seek to take advantage of Serum Powder these days, the card is undeniably one of the strongest effects in Magic. While the mulligan is an integral part of the game, it's not a mechanic that cards tend to interact with. The original set Serum Powder was from, Darksteel, was from a block that heavily experimented with artifact card design. Mirrored block would produce several artifacts that would go on to define later design for years to come. Serum Powder, in comparison, feels like one of those failed experiments, a one-off dip in design space that Wizards has shown little to no interest in pursuing further. Unlike previous Mirrored artifact Time Shift, however, Serum Powder's design space is wholly unique. The only other card to reference the mulligan by name is a conspiracy card called Backup Plan, and even then its effect does not alter mulligans and simply gives you additional actions before going to mulligans. As such, Serum Powder is the only time a card in any capacity has directly interacted with mulligans. Beyond this, however, the card itself is fairly straightforward. If mulligans were referenced more in future cards, we might look at Serum Powder as not a weird card, but as the first in a long line of designs. While Eldrazi decks are perhaps the ones that benefit the most directly, Serum Powder has been played historically in various decks as a consistency tool. For combo decks, getting to not only have an extra mulligan, but start with less cards in the deck to find the combo faster can be rather relevant. As such, this oddity is not only unique, but one of the more playable cards on this list. And at number 4, we have Riding the Dilu Horse. This is a sorcery for 2 generic and 1 green mana, which gives target creature +2 power and toughness and horsemanship. At surface level, the weirdest aspect of the card might seem to be the keyword ability Horsemanship. A creature with Horsemanship can't be blocked except by creatures with Horsemanship. If this sounds familiar, it's likely because this is almost identical to the keyword Flying. This is because Riding the Dilu Horse is from the set Portal 3 Kingdoms, which was designed for the APAC region to introduce people to the game. Not only was the game simplified, the aesthetics were shifted from Western fantasy to the romance of the 3 kingdoms. As such, instead of flying creatures, the evasion creatures were riders on horseback. Recent cards have since riffed on the idea of giving certain creatures horsemanship as a flavorful version of being essentially unblockable. And as a whole, this alone does not make the card worth a spot on this list, least of all one so high. But notably, Riding the Dilu Horse's effect is worded like a temporary buff would be worded, yet is not actually temporary. There was no until end of turn printed on Riding the Dilu Horse, and as such, both the stat boost and ability remain on the creature as long as the creature is on the battlefield. Modern day cards and even older cards in the same period would generally mark permanent changes with a token or the like. Instead, you must track the creature's new stats yourself, which can get confusing as the board state gets more and more complicated. This combined with the arcade keyword ability makes Riding the Dilu Horse a rather clunky relic of an experimental time for the game. The Portal sets would end with the 3 kingdoms, but Magic the Gathering would continue to grow in the APAC region despite the set itself being something of a mixed bag. Today is remembered mostly as a novelty, with a few notable cards with rather high price tags for either their playability or uniqueness. Riding the Dilu Horse is one such card, not for any actual strength, but sheerly for its novelty as a blatant design mistake in an example of a mechanic that's only now used as a callback. And at number 3, we have Steamflogger Boss. This creature is a goblin rigger that has a 3 power and toughness that costs 3 generic and 1 red mana. Other rigger creatures you control get +1 power and haste, and if a rigger you control would assemble a contraption, it assembles 2 contraptions instead. This card was first printed in the set Future Sight, a set which attempted to predict the future of Magic. Steamflogger Boss is one of the most infamous cards in the set, considering that at the time of its printing, there were no other riggers in the game, let alone the fact that contraptions also did not exist. This would be the case for several years. It was only with this set unstable that we would actually get actual contraption cards. Contraptions are artifact cards without typical mana cost that exist in a separate contraption deck. Whenever you assemble a contraption, you put the top card of your contraption deck into one of your 3 sprockets. When this mechanic was first revealed, many compared it to Yu-Gi-Oh's extra deck system, with it being a smaller, separate deck of cards you could play into specific zones. Unstable would also bring with it other riggers like Joyride Rigger and retroactively give Steamflogger Boss an actual use. However, considering this was the set Unstable, none of the other riggers or especially the contraptions were actually legal for sanctioned play. Steamflogger Boss, for the purposes of actual legal Magic the Gathering, is still the only rigger with no contraption it can assemble. Unstable leaned into this by reprinting Steamflogger Boss as the only non-basic land border card in the otherwise silver border set. However, beyond this joke set's release, Steamflogger Boss remains little more than an oddity today. Beyond drafting Unstable, there are very few instances where people will play with these unset cards. So unless your commander playgroup agrees to it beforehand, there's a good chance you'll never play a game of Magic where Steamflogger Boss can actually do anything beyond maybe give a second copy of Steamflogger Boss 1 more power and haste. And at number 2, we have Divine Intervention. This enchantment from the set Legends costs 6 generic and 2 white mana. Beyond having the signature high mana value of Legends rare, Divine Intervention enters the battlefield with 2 intervention counters on it. At the beginning of your upkeep, you remove an intervention counter from Divine Intervention. When you remove the last intervention counter from Divine Intervention, the game is a draw. There are other ways to end the game in the draw, most notably making an infinite loop that you cannot stop and does not result in a win or loss will cause a draw. But this is the only card in Magic that actually explicitly makes the game result a draw. It's also not that hard to trigger, beyond costing a lot of mana once it's played. All it takes is passing enough turns and removing enough counters for the draw to trigger. The card is simple in what it does, yet what it does is quite complicated. Players actively play to win the game. The goal of the game of Magic the Gathering is to win. A card which forces a draw can only be used to potentially prevent a loss, not by winning yourself, but by denying the ability for your opponent to win. In a proper 3-game match, it can be used as a catch-up tool. If you won the first game and are losing the second, you can force a draw to keep yourself ahead of the match. Generally speaking, this line of play is not encouraged, and draws primarily exist just when games need to end without a winner. No other cards in Magic the Gathering offer a direct draw like this. Much like Serum Powder, it's an aspect of the game that always exists but is never actually referenced by cards itself. Unlike Serum Powder, the act of drawing the game is much more risky to toy with than something like Mulligan. Forcing a draw by simply removing counters from an enchantment can invalidate the entire game that came before it. Of course, the card can be disrupted, just removing the card is enough to get rid of it, and the mana value alone will give you plenty of time to find a way to remove or counter it before it's even played. But that does not make its ability any less warping or weird for Magic. And it remains unique if only because of how unpopular the idea of drawing the game actually is. And finally, at number 1, we have Chaos Orb. This artifact was printed in Alpha, the very first set, and costs 2 generic mana. You can pay 1 mana and tap it. Then you may flip Chaos Orb onto the battlefield from a height of at least 1 foot. If Chaos Orb turns over completely at least once during the flip, destroy all non-token permanents it touches. Then destroy Chaos Orb. This is an example of a dexterity card, a card which requires you to do some sort of physical action for the card's effect to resolve. Beyond concerns of physical accessibility or digital play, it's also now adding a physical element one must practice and train for to be properly playable. Even in Alpha, there were other cards that destroyed multiple permanents at once, such as the famous Nevinyrral's Disc. Chaos Orb's actual effect on the game is nothing unique, but the means by which you do it has led to becoming one of the most infamous cards in the game. There is a well-known urban legend that some players back in the early days of Magic would rip their copies of Chaos Orbs into pieces, then toss them into the air in order to destroy as many permanents as possible. This story, whether or not it was actually true, became so well known that it would later be referenced in the comedy set Unglued with the card Chaos Confetti. Chaos Orb is so infamous that other Magic cards have poked fun at its impact. It's also a card that is banned in every format, a quality that is not shared by even any of the strongest cards in the game. Even Black Lotus is only restricted in Vintage, whereas Chaos Orb and other dexterity cards are so outside the realm of what is considered an okay Magic card that it's outright banned. There are other infamous weird cards out there, such as Shahrazad, which makes you play a game of Magic within a game of Magic. But Chaos Orb represents a mechanic that has not just been abandoned, but outright erased, with the only other mechanic treated with similar level being the mechanic where people actually gambled away their cards. There will never be another card like Chaos Orb, and remains one of the weirdest cards that has ever been printed, and likely always will be. Alright, and that's the list. Are there any other very weird abilities we may have missed, or have any ideas for future videos just like this one? If so, please let us know down in the comments below.